And one day I went into Paul's locker, pulled out his jockstrap, and just put it over my face and sniffed it as much as I could. Maybe that's a fetish of mine, I don't know. Hi, this is Mike Balaban with another episode of BAMMER Tales. Before I begin, if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube page, please do so now. I'd love to have you as a permanent part of our community. That is the community I'm trying to build. Today I'm going to do something a little unusual. Till now I've kind of gone episode by episode through my life or issue by issue through topics of importance to the gay community. Today I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour, a journey through my first 24 years from being born to coming out fully as a gay man. My parents ran away from their parents and raised me and my younger two siblings on a cattle ranch in the panhandle of Florida, almost on the Alabama border. It was a backwards area. We were Jews, the only Jewish family in the county. That made us very different, and I got taunted sometimes early on for that, but gradually they got to know me and us and realized, hey, we're nice people, and Jews must not be all that bad, even if they kill Christ. So it was a very conservative area, very sports-oriented. When I went to kindergarten at age 5, it was the first time I was around other white boys my age. It was a segregated county, and my early playmates were sharecroppers' kids, black, on our cattle ranch. At 5, I walked into Mrs. Bush's kindergarten on the other side of the town, out of which we were 5 miles on the highway in the other direction. And I walked into her kindergarten, and pretty quickly, my eyes lit upon Andy Howell. And Andy was the golden boy to be. He knew it. Why? Because his father was the coach and the most popular guy in every sport in town. And Andy would eventually be the captain of every team he tried out for and the leader. And all that meant that he was slated. He was royalty. And so I immediately fell for him. And I was infatuated. And we used to play together, and I tried to get him to like me more than others, and it never happened. But one day during that year, at recess or at lunch, when the teacher was not watching us, Andy suggested that he and I and a girl named Sherry go out behind the big oak tree in the back and play doctor. And that just piqued my interest, and I wanted to look at Andy. I could care less about looking at Sherry. That was my first indication. But again, I buried that, and I spent the next 10 years until we left Bonifay trying to get to be Andy's best friend, whatever that meant. And while I was one of his friends, he didn't take to me more than anybody else. And so I didn't realize at that time, or really until a few years ago in my 60s, that I'm demisexual, meaning that I focus on one person and that I have to be physically attracted to them, but also I have to be chemically, emotionally attracted to them. So Andy was my target for 10 years. Never went anywhere, but it was all I knew. When I was 15, my father ripped my family out of northern Florida. Why? Because he decided he wanted to be a jazz musician. He'd always hung out with them when he was growing up. He taught himself to play, and there were no jazz opportunities in the panhandle of Florida. So we moved back to where he'd gone to prep school in New Haven, Connecticut, and he began doing jobs, a lot of them in New York City, but everywhere, organizing them, being the band leader, until his father died a few years later, and he took the money he inherited and opened Eddie Condon's Jazz Club, the third version of that. My father had been a friend of Eddie Condon's, as one of the jazz legends. My father ran that club, arguably the most famous jazz club in the world at the time, and it was an amazing place to go to. So when we moved north during my sophomore year in high school, I was intimidated by the size of this high school, 3,000 plus students, 650 students in my class. My entire high school, 7th to 12th grades in Bonifay, Florida, had only had 500 people in it. So I was so intimidated, I didn't go out for sports teams. Now, deep inside, as I began to realize that I was attracted to certain boys, I had to prove to myself that that was just a phase and I was straight. So I went out for all these sport teams and learned to love sports and played them adequately. Like our junior year in West Haven, we were the state champions in football. Eventually, I would play when I got to Brown, my first 2 years on varsity football in college. But there I was in the high school, initially intimidated, then joining the team in my second year there. And there was only one person in that high school who I had eyes for. His name was Paul Coughlin, and maybe we'll put up a photo or two of him. I can do that now because Paul passed away from a heart attack a decade or more ago. There was no response from him to my interest. We weren't in the same crowd of friends. He was in the cool crowd. I was in a weird position where being on the football team, where only 2 out of 30 players in my class got 1,000 or more on their college boards. Mine was about 1,400. I would hang out with the smart kids, but then on the football and track and basketball, I hung out with the athletes. But I was never really part of Paul's group, and so I really couldn't get close enough. I just idolized him from afar. Now, one thing that I've never admitted before this is that when I joined the basketball team as a manager, because I wasn't good enough to play, it's not a glamorous job. You take care of all the laundry, you keep the score during the game, etc. But it got me into the locker room after practice, and one day I went into Paul's locker, pulled out his jockstrap, and just put it over my face and sniffed it as much as I could. Maybe that's a fetish of mine, I don't know. But that was my entire history of anything gay in high school. I dated women. I tried to have sex with them. I couldn't make myself get excited, so instead I'd perform cunnilingus. Not any interest in that anymore. Then I went to graduate school at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. And it was a totally straight year. No one there to be interested in or attracted to. A lot of work on the docket. But near the end of the year, I saw an after-hours newspaper, the Boston After Dark, with the underground ads and personal ads, and I answered one from a medical student who said he was really handsome and well-built and, need tuition for med school, would be willing to do anything with a woman or a guy for money. By the way, he never asked me for money. We did get together. I brought him back to my suite in my dorm in the grad school. My suite mate was away on holiday or something, and I had to get high on weed in order to be able to relax enough. And my memory of that is me almost in an out-of-body experience, looking down at this grad student, med student, in my crotch giving me a blowjob. And he did it twice, and I didn't do anything to him, even though I offered, but wasn't sure I wanted to. And afterwards I said, well, so does that make me gay? It was quite explosive, but it had no meaning. And that's the first when I really began to realize that I needed to feel something for someone. So I said to myself, what if it had been Andy Howell or Paul Coughlin, and they'd been there doing that to me? Would that have been more pleasurable? And the answer was unequivocally yes. I still wasn't ready to admit I was gay, but I was beginning to realize I couldn't avoid that. So I left grad school at the end of that semester, moved to Washington, D.C. in my first job, and I was miserable. I hated the government job I was in. I couldn't be my true self. I didn't know how to be my true self. And then one day in December of '75, I read the local newspaper on the way to my work near the White House, and it said, Dave Kopay comes out, former NFL Washington Redskin, comes out as gay. And I was like, oh my God, there's another jock and he's gay. At that point in time, everyone assumed that there were a lot of female athletes who were gay because they were very butch, but that there were no male athletes who were gay because gay men couldn't withstand all that testosterone and measure up and be butch and do whatever jocks did. It was a stupid assumption, but it was commonplace. And then Dave broke that myth with his article in the paper, and I was so shocked. I wrote him a letter care of the newspaper, and they forwarded it. And he looked me up in the white pages back then, called the number, and got me on a Saturday napping in my one-bedroom apartment and invited me out for a drink. And I was like, oh my God. So I went out for a drink with him, not knowing could something happen between us? What is this? What's going to be like? And it was just pretty humdrum. And he was a good guy. And he explained to me how he'd come out, and he told me that I could be myself and be masculine and unaffected and not be ashamed. And that was a lot to feed a 23-year-old like me, and gave me the confidence. A month later, when my best friend from the previous year in grad school came to visit me, to stay up late with him one night and tell him that I thought I might be gay. That was January 23rd, 1976. And he was uncomfortable in his response, but he didn't reject me, and I was just thrilled with that. It took 25 years to realize why he'd been uncomfortable. He later on left his wife and child and came out as gay himself, and I would be the best man in his marriage to his Hong Kong husband. After I told, his name was Speedy, that I was gay on January 23rd, 1976, I then began going to some of the bars that Dave Cope had recommended I visit. And on March 6th, I see this gorgeous, muscular, blonde, masculine image walking across the dance floor and crossing my path. I look up, he looks down, and I get a hello and hi. He asked him if I wanted to dance, and we did. And then he asked if I wanted to go somewhere together. I said, sure. But because he was visiting friends, he couldn't take me there. I had to bring him back to my place. And that would be the beginning of a 2-week affair while he was in the D.C. area that let me understand that there could be romance between two men. And from then on, I was off and running. That's my first 24 years. Bonifay, Florida, till I was 15. New Haven, Connecticut, until graduation from high school. Brown University, when I was in my late teens and early 20s. Fletcher School, at graduate school in Tufts in 1974-5, and then coming out in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of 1976. From that point on, I told everyone except people on my job, which was very conservative Wall Street. I couldn't be out there, but all the people in my life knew I was gay, and I owned who I was. Have you had similar experiences? Let me know. Love to hear from you. Thanks for listening to another episode of BAMMER Tales.